Hello. So this is a presentation video for Chapter 9. Chapter 9, we're going to talk about creating web applications with ASP.NET. So when we talk about web applications, that's different than web pages or websites. When you think of a web page or a website, or a web page typically is a static page, kind of like a brochure website where you're just getting information from. You're not typing any information in. It's not doing any calculations like the applications that we've been building so far. When we build web applications, so they are actually running on a server. So you can do a lot of processing on that server. You can do calculations just like we would be doing with our web applications so far this year. So there's some pluses and minuses with ASP.NET. One of the big positives with doing an ASP.NET website is it's platform independent. So you are ultimately publishing this web application on a server, and the results of what you're writing in ASP.NET is served up in HTML. So that HTML can be viewed on any platform, Linux, Macs, or any other platform that you need to. So you've got some platform independence there. The other advantage is when you're making changes to the application, you don't have to push it out to all the end users. All you do is publish it to the website, the user refreshes their browser, and they get the latest code. Think about if you had 1,000 users and you were writing a Windows application and you needed to make a change. You need to change a label or add a text box. All the users have that application installed on their desktop. So you make that change, you've got to push those changes out to all those desktops. Everyone has to make sure they install it. If they don't do that, then they don't get your latest changes. So that is a huge advantage to ASP.NET. Some disadvantages to using ASP.NET, ASP.NET web pages or sites run on the web. So they can be slower if you have slow internet speed, if you have a slow server, and creating ASP.NET websites, as you will see, is going to be more complicated than creating Windows forms that we've been creating so far this year, because ultimately what Visual Studio is going to do is it's going to create an HTML page. Everything that gets served up to the user is in an HTML page. So you have to deal with formatting, you have to deal with validation. There's all kinds of things that don't happen as easily when you're just dealing with HTML. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this video, and then when we're going through the guided program walkthrough. I'm actually going to do things in the guided program walkthrough a little bit differently than they do in the book. In the book, they use a site master template that kind of gets really, really complicated, more than what we need. So we're going to do it a little bit different way. So if you go back and look at the guided program walkthrough of the book that I follow through, what I'm doing in the video is going to be a little bit different than that. So don't worry about that. Trust me, I'm making it easier for you. So let's start talking about what we're going to be doing in this chapter. So we're going to be creating web applications and building what they call web forms using ASP.NET. We'll be setting properties of the forms just like we did our Windows forms, and the objects on those forms have properties. So there's going to be definitely some similarities that you'll see as we're going through doing our UI designs, but there's also going to be some pretty distinct differences. When we were designing Windows forms, you had the designer and the code. You're going to have the designer, you can have the code, and you can have the HTML. So you can change the code in the designer sometimes. Sometimes you want to go to the HTML to change things. Sometimes you'll change something in the HTML. They actually call it source, I think, not HTML, but sometimes you'll change it in the HTML or source, and it won't come out as differently. It can be a little frustrating working with ASP.NET. Just like anything else, there's a learning curve, but you'll get used to it as we go through this chapter. We won't do a lot of ASP.NET apps. It's just this chapter, but I want to at least introduce all of you to this because a lot of apps are built using ASP.NET. We'll talk about adding our objects to our web form, just like we do to a Windows form, except we have to deal with some layout stuff that we'll talk about. We'll introduce a couple new objects, one of them being a drop-down list, which is similar to a list box, kind of like a combination between a list box and a text box. So we'll use those in some of our applications. We'll also add a calendar object that lets you easily pick dates rather than using a format string. We'll talk about using tables for layout, something that we used to do in HTML a long time ago. When CSS3 came out, we went away from that because of absolute and relative positioning. And you can use CSS with your ASP.NET web pages and websites, but it gets really complicated and we really don't have time for that with these chapters. It would just take way too long. So we'll stick with our formatting using tables just for now, just to get through the formatting and the layout stuff. Normally you would use absolute and relative position to format your objects, but that just, it gets really time consuming with this stuff, and we're not going to go back there. Another issue, well, not issue, but a difference with ASP.NET pages is validating data. So with ASP.NET, when you click a button to save something or submit something, all that data that you're clicking that button gets submitted to the server, it gets processed in the server, and then it gets passed back to the end user in the browser. And that takes some time. So if you're validating data, the users are going to get frustrated if they validate something and it takes 30 seconds for which isn't really a long time, but if users are entering a lot of data in a web page and it's taking 30 seconds every time they enter something wrong, they get frustrated. So what you really want to do is you want to do your validation on the client side, so in the HTML. And with an HTML pages, there's really two ways to do that. With JavaScript, and we're not going to get into JavaScript with this chapter. So luckily, Visual Studio with ASP.NET has some validation tools built in. So we'll kind of dig a little bit into those validation tools that does all that validation on the client side. It doesn't actually have to post everything back to the server and you have to wait for it. So that makes things a little faster. We'll talk about using the BR or break tag in Visual Basic Code. Sometimes you want to format things and you do have to manipulate the HTML. So you do that using the break tag, kind of like what we do to concatenate things in our strings when we want to take some data from a text box or from a variable and combine that with some text. You use concatenate and you put a string together. It's similar to that. And we will talk a lot about string manipulation and some of the methods that we use to format data when you're dealing with passing data to a server. You want to make sure you're not passing any extra data. So you want to be able to trim the data and make sure the data that you're sending is clean. So you're not sending anything extra to the server to slow things down. So we'll do a little bit of string manipulation to clean things up and make sure the data that we're sending to the server is clean. While we're working through this, we won't actually be sending anything to a server. Visual Studio creates a mini kind of a virtual server for you to run your code, and acts like an actual web server, but it's really just a program running on your computer. So with our VB apps, Windows apps, when you compiled your applications, it created an executable. We're not creating an executable, we're creating HTML pages. The way we actually create an executable is we actually publish your web app to a server. And we won't be doing that because we don't have a server. It'll just run locally on our computers. If we did have a server, we could publish these and they would be out on the web or out on an intranet server, but we won't deal with that right All right, so let's get into this and start talking about it. Visual Studio allows you to create applications that can run on the internet, on the web. BB 2017 includes ASP.NET technology with which you can create user interface and a form for a web application. So ASP, when we talk about ASP, that stands for Active Server Page. So active meaning it's interactive, you can enter data into it, and server, it actually lives on a server. So when you hit an ASP.NET website, you're pulling down a program that's run and serving up HTML for you. Okay, so that's what ASP is. And before ASP.NET, there was classic ASP, and that's been around for probably 20 years. And you could, create websites that interacted with databases and stuff like that. Microsoft came up with ASP.NET probably about 10 years ago, just kind of rolled it up into Visual Studio because they knew the internet was going to be this great big thing, so they took advantage of it to allow developers to create web pages. So a web form is a page displayed in a web browser such as Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and Firefox, and request data from a user. So your ASP.NET websites are going to run in Chrome, Microsoft Edge, and Firefox. Visual Studio is a Microsoft product, so your pages are going to work best in Microsoft Edge. They should work in Chrome and Firefox, but you might see some differences depending on what you're doing. You have to deal with formatting. That's just kind of one of the drawbacks with using web technologies. Things are going to possibly look different when you're viewing in different browsers, just like HTML does. Apps created on ASP.NET are published to a Windows web server, IIS, which is Internet Information Services. If you've ever dealt with Windows web servers, Internet Information Services is just a program that sits on your Windows server, which makes that server a website. So you just give the website a name, that's the URL you browse to. And that's where, if you were publishing this on the internet, you would publish it to your server, your Internet Information Services server. All right, so question one that I want you to answer for me is, what does ASP.NET or ASP stand for? Okay, so the ASP, what does that stand for? All right, so the application we're going to be creating and the guided program walkthrough is Moonbeam Glamping guest reservation form. So glamping is, I guess, glamorous camping. So we're creating a reservation form for a company that has a camping site, and people are booking nights. So you enter a name, an email address, a type of tent that you're going to rent, the number of nights, and a date, and then we have a submit button. So this is basically what our web page is going to look like. Okay, nothing too complicated here. As you can imagine, we're going to have to do validation, but this is going to be basically what we're looking at. So a web page that allows users to enter information on a web form is considered a dynamic web page because the user enters data and the web page reacts to the data. A static web page contains no interactivity. So that's when you're talking about a web page, just a brochure website, no interactivity, you're just looking at the site. Think about your general restaurant websites where you look at a menu and that's it. The sites we're creating are going to be more than that, they're interactive. A web server is a computer that stores web documents and makes them available to people on the internet. The ASP.NET technology used with Visual Basic creates an active server page. So the active server page is what's going to serve up the HTML to your end users ultimately. So this is what the basic template's going to look like. You'll see in the bottom here, we have design, split, and source. So design, if you're clicked on that, you're going to see kind of what the web page looks like. You can split and you can see both, and then the source is going to show you your HTML. And then when we get into coding, you're going to have another page up there where you enter in your Visual Basic code or your C# code. So it looks very similar. We're going to have toolbars. We're going to have a solution explorer. We're going to have a properties window. But rather than a Windows form, it's going to actually be a web page that we're looking at here. So kind of the same, but different. Visual Basic 2017 provides a starter template to assist you in designing a web page. The site master file is a master page that provides an overall layout for the site with headers, buttons, and footers. A master page is designed to create a consistent layout for the pages in your application. I think when I go through this with you guys, we are not going to use the site master, and the master page. It, like I said earlier, it makes things a little more complicated. You have to delete a lot of things, and I think we're just going to stick with some simple pages is another way of doing it that I always used to do when I was doing things for real. So I'm going to try it that way and see how it works out. We'll see when I actually get to the video, though. So this kind of shows you here what your Solution Explorer looks like, and you'll notice there's a lot more stuff in there, and this is with the site master. When I do it with you with just not using the site master, there'll be less, but you're still going to have a lot of folders and a lot of objects here, and you'll see your pages end in ASP.x. You have a web config file. You have a bunch of other stuff in there that we'll get into in the guided program development. So again, there's going to be some differences. There's going to be some complexity to get used to, but you guys will get used to it as you start going through these pages. So we'll be customizing pages. Even if I don't go through the site master template, we'll still have an HTML page. We'll put headings in there. We'll put titles in there, just to kind of give the page a title like you normally would. So placing your objects in the web page is going to be very similar to placing objects on web forms. You can see you have a standard toolbar. You're just going to drag your text boxes, your label. Actually, you don't actually use labels with ASP.NET. You just put text on the screen. So that's one thing that makes things a little easier for you. If you don't like using naming conventions on labels, you don't necessarily have to do that with ASP.NET. So what we'll be dealing with mostly in this chapter is our standard toolbox categories. That's going to be our text boxes and our drop-down boxes and our calendar controls and our validation controls that we'll use for validating our data, because we don't want to get into JavaScript for doing that at this point. So like I said, we don't use labels with ASP.NET necessarily. So you just, rather than putting a label in, you could just put text in the web page. So this is just an example of the page you're going to be creating. Not much to it. So this slide is just showing you an example of how we're going to do layout with ASP.NET. So on a typical HTML web page, you'd use absolute and relative positioning to format and display all your different text boxes. We're going to use tables. We're going to just create a 3x7 table. We're going to put our text in. We're going to put our text box in, and we're going to put our validation control, and we'll be able to line things up easily and, most importantly, quickly for going through these pages, because again, like I said, it can get fairly complicated when you're dealing with CSS and stuff like that. So we're going to try to make this chapter as easy as possible for formatting stuff. So this is just an example of how we're going to format your reservation form using a 3 by, I think, 7 table for entering all your text boxes and labels. We'll get into that in the guided program development. You can see here we've got a couple text boxes and a couple labels. This is that 3 by 7 table I was telling you about. So you enter your text directly on the form rather than putting a label in there. Then you just drop the text box in the next cell of the table. We're going to be using checkboxes as well. This is the tent selections section. So they enter their name, they enter the email address, and they can pick one or more of the 3 tents that they can reserve on your website. So, and there's a different price for each one, and you'll be adding those up if they pick all 3 or just one. And we'll use a drop-down-list object to select a number of nights that they're going to stay in this tent. So this is a new object we haven't used so far. Maybe some of you have kind of played around with it, and that's fine. But this is the first official use of the drop-down-list object. So we'll use that for the number of nights in this chapter. And then we'll also be adding a calendar object. And this is a pretty rich object, kind of more complicated than a lot of the other objects and controls that we've been using so far. But it's just like any other control that has properties. So you're going to drop it on your form. You can format it. You can change the color. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. Just color schemes. We'll select the color scheme, and then it just sits there and allows the user to select the date, and then that date is passed back to a text box. So this is just what the final form is going to pretty much look like when we're done. It's pretty simple, right? Entering a name, entering an email address, selecting one or more checkboxes, number of nights, a date, and ultimately there'll be a submit button on here. When you hit that submit button, the data is going to go back to the server for all the processing, the adding and subtracting and all that stuff, and outputting the data is going to come back, and it's going to be displayed on this form for us. So this is just some examples of how to format the data that we get from our calendar object. So you can see here our naming convention we use for a calendar is CLD. Okay, so we get the selected date from that, and then we use the toShort date string to kind of format in the month, day, year format. And a little more code, so we check if those checked boxes are checked, and then we look at the selected date. If they've selected a date past today or less than today, we display an error. Oops, I just went too far. Otherwise, we move on. So when you click a button on an ASP.NET app, the app needs to run the code in the server and return the results back to you. And I talked to you a little bit about this earlier. This can take a long time if there's a lot of traffic on the web server or if you have a slow web server. So this is basically validation, right? We've been doing this all along, working with a lot of ways to validate things. So with HTML, you have 2 choices to work with validation. You can either embed client-side JavaScript code in your HTML to perform validation, and that's a great way to do things. But ASP.NET does have some built-in validation controls that make things really easy for you. So you don't have to write all that JavaScript code and make your code overly complicated. So that's what we'll be digging into with this chapter, using those validation controls. So some of the validation controls that we have are a required field validation. So that makes an input control a required field, and you've all seen this on websites. You can't go past um, the page until you actually fill in, put data into that text box. We have a compare validator, which compares the value of one input to another input control. Or to a fixed value. So this might be if you're having users enter a password and you want to validate that they've entered the same the password correctly. So you make them enter it twice and you compare those two values to each other. We have range validators. Check the user enters a value that falls within two values. So in a lot of our applications we've created this year, you want to make sure the user enters a value between 1 and 20. So this is something you could use for that. We have a regular expression validator, ensures that the value of an input control matches a specified pattern. So this would be like for an email address, for example. You want to make sure they have an @ and a .com in there. So you do that with a regular expression validator. We also have custom validators. So this allows you to write a method to handle the validation of the value entered. So this lets you kind of pretty much do anything you want to do with validation. And then lastly, we have the validation summary. This displays a report of all validation errors that occurred in the web page. So if a user made more than one mistake or missed more than one thing on the web page, you kind of put a summary of all those things at the bottom. So our next question that I have for you is, why do we need validation controls on an ASP.NET web page? So why do we need these? Why is it important to have these validation controls on a web page? Why can't we just validate the way we normally would in a Windows app? And I think I missed question 2 as I was going along here, so we're only going to have 3 questions in here. All right, so this is an example of adding our required field validator. So our field validators are just objects. So just objects that we're going to drag into somewhere on the form. You give it a naming convention. Excuse me. So a naming convention for the required field validators are RFV. So required field validator, and then it's on the name. Text box, so it's RFV name, and then you associate that required field validator with a text box object, and we'll get into how to do that in the guided program walkthrough. But this just kind of shows you that's very similar to what we've been doing all along with our Windows apps. So if we're doing a range validator, we have a couple properties that we'll be dealing with. The control that we're validating, so is it a text box, is it a drop-down box, the minimum value, the maximum value, the type, so the property max is a data type in the value since it's an integer or string. So think about, previously we were really being cautious and making sure the user didn't enter a decimal when they're supposed to enter an integer. This is going to take care of that for you. And then the error message, that's what we want our user to see when they do enter something outside the range that they were entering it in. So this is just an example of how you would set the properties for the compare validator. See, we have the control to compare, the control to validate. So these are the 2 text boxes that we're comparing. Our name, so the control validator is, it looks like CMV, and then it's passwords. And then the error message down here, passwords do not match. Okay, so pretty straightforward. And again, we'll get into this a little in a lot more detail when we go through the guided program development. So the same with the regular expression validator, we're going to have the control to validate. The property contains the name of the object that you're validating. And I think I mentioned this is something we'd use for an email address, the error message that we want to display. property contains a message saying the value does not match a valid format, and a validation expression. Property allows you to select the format for the object. So this is where you put in the format string for email addresses. And you can see they've used that for the email address field, and the user entered, doesn't have an @ it looks like, in the email address. So the validator picked that up and it displayed a message beside that field that says error in email format. Okay. And again, this all happens client side. So as soon as you click off that field, that validation error is going to pop up. It's not being passed back to the server or anything. It's all happening client side, which is what we want. We can enter multiple validations if we want for one field. So in this one, we're adding a required field validator because we want hours work to be required, but we also have a range validator in there. So we're adding 2 validation controls for one text box. And you can put as many as you want in there. You don't want to go too crazy with it, but obviously you can add multiple validations if you want to. And the validation summary controls is the last one we'll be dealing with in this chapter. It lets you display validation error messages in a single location, creating a clean layout for the web form. You can use the validation summary object to display all the error messages in a different place, listing them in a blank area at the top of the bottom of the form. So you just have a standard place where you display all the issues or all the things that the user missed when they enter in their data. To use a validation summary object, drag the object to the location on the web page where you want the summary to appear. So this is just going to summarize all the validation issues that the user had when they were entering data in the page. So the last question that I want you to answer is, what is the validation summary control used for? Why would we want to use validation summary control on our pages? Okay, so this is just an example of where we're going to use the break tag. And you can see next to the calendar, this is our reservation confirmation message. So we've taken, the user has entered all their data, hit submit, the processing has happened on the server, and the page is served back to us. And we're displaying the message for the user. So we're saying a reservation has been made for, and we break. So we're putting a break in, because remember, we can't just do a line control because this is HTML. So we actually have to put that break in to have it come down to the next line and display the name of the user. It looks like, I'm really having a hard time reading this, :Fox maybe, I don't know. So we display the name, we break again, we display the email address, we break again. So this is, it's similar to the concatenating strings that we were doing before, but we're just introducing one more object here with the HTML break tag. And we go through to format all this data and just put breaks so that it doesn't kind of go off the page, okay? Because with HTML, it'll do that. So we've got to put those breaks in to kind of format it a little clean. And again, this isn't like the cleanest page I've ever seen, but this will allow you to clean it up a little more, okay? Again, we'll get into this a little more in the guided program walkthrough. So another thing we're going to be digging into a little bit more in this chapter is some of our string properties. So the length property is determined to use the number of characters of a particular string. So if you want to look at a string and see how many characters are in it, you can use this dot length. It'll return how many characters are in a string. And that's important if you wanted to parse data. So if you had a first name and last name, and you wanted to break that up, you want to get just the last name out, sometimes you'll have to get the length of it so you can kind of calculate how long it is. There's a lot of other different string objects that we'll be using to do that. So in this example, they're actually looking at a zip code and they're making sure the length is 5 characters because we know all zip codes have to be 5 characters. If it's not 5 characters, we display an error that says you must enter 5 digits. Okay, so that's another example that you could use the length property for. And there's many others. Visual Basic Alt provides a procedure called trim to remove spaces from the beginning and end of a string. So sometimes when you're dealing with HTML text boxes, user could potentially enter an extra space at the end of a name or at the beginning of a name or something like that. And we don't want to display that ultimately in a database or on a page. So when you send that data, or before you send that data to the server, you could trim those extra spaces at the beginning and the end of a string off so the data is clean. And that's what trim does for you. So we'll be doing a little bit of that as well, just to clean up our data. Another string property that we can use is toUpper and toLower. So this will make all our text that was entered either uppercase if we want it to be, or lowercase if we want it to be. Okay, so certain data we might want to display no matter what the user entered, all uppercase or all lowercase. Okay, so those are just 2 properties that you have in there to make things upper and lowercase. And this is it. This is the this is a program specification that you'll be using for the guided program walkthrough. Not a whole lot to it, but it'll be a bit of a challenge because the introducing HTML for these web pages adds a little bit of complexity. And again, there's a learning curve with the validation controls and everything, but I think you guys will enjoy it once you get past the initial frustration. So this is it for the Chapter 9 presentation video. I'll see you in the next video.